Hello, my name is Jurgis Karpus. I'm a postdoc in the Faculty of Philosophy at LMU Munich, and here I'll give you a brief introduction to the theory of team reasoning and the idea of group rationality within the broader framework of game theory. Game theory studies interactive decision-making. Put simply, whenever we interact with other decision-makers, we play a game. From the normative point of view, the theory is interested in the behavior of perfectly rational decision-makers. Its goal is to prescribe the best choices for us to attain our personal objectives. From the descriptive point of view, the theory aims to predict and explain why we do what we do when we interact with others. The standard theory is built on the assumption of best response reasoning. According to this assumption, rational players choose actions that best satisfy their personal preferences given their beliefs about what other players in the game do. When all players act rationally and do the best that they can given what everybody else is doing, they are in a Nash equilibrium. And since no player has an incentive to act differently from how they do in an equilibrium, this is said to be a rational solution of a game. For an example, let's look at the famous prisoner's dilemma game. Here, two players, simultaneously and independently from one another, choose one of two options: cooperate or defect. There are four possible outcomes of the two players' choices in this game, and the number pairs in each outcome of the game are payoffs to the row and the column player respectively. The interpretation of payoffs matters. For our purposes, these are numerical representations of how the two players preferentially rank the four outcomes of the game, so that the highest number is associated with the outcome that the player prefers the most, and the lowest number with an outcome that the player prefers the least. In this game, rational best response reasoning players will always defect. This is so because irrespective of what the other player does, a player always prefers to defect. And indeed, mutual defection constitutes the only Nash equilibrium and as such the only rational solution of this game. This solution is socially suboptimal because both players prefer the outcome in which they both cooperate. But a rational player will never cooperate in this game because if they believe that the other player cooperates with them, they personally prefer to defect. That said, in experiments with a one-shot version of this game, roughly half of people cooperate. There are many explanations on offer for why that happens, and the theory of team reasoning will provide one such explanation. But before we get there, let's look at another example. In the high-low game, two players, again simultaneously and independently from one another, choose one of two options, the high or a low prize. If they both choose the high prize, they get a high payoff. If they both choose the low prize, they get a low payoff. But if they miscoordinate their actions, they get nothing. Now, it's obvious what both players should do in this game. They should choose the high prize. But the best response reasoning fails to resolve this decision problem. All that it does is give a conditional recommendation. It says that if the other player chooses high, you should choose high. But if the other player chooses low, you should choose low. What it doesn't do is tell you what the other player will do, because it gives the other player the same conditional recommendation. Mutual choice of high and mutual choice of low both are Nash equilibria in this game. And as such, both are rational solutions. But mutual choice of low seems unconvincing as a rational solution in this game. Now, of course, low is the best response to the other player's choice of low. But the question here is, why would anyone believe that a rational player might choose low in the first place? Best response reasoning is simply silent about why high is the obvious choice in this game. Here is an example of the high-low game in practice. Suppose me and you stand close to two opposing ends of the table when somebody asks us to move this table to another location in the room. It seems obvious that we should both walk to the closest end of the table to us, lift it and carry it over to where it needs to go. Now, that's not the only way how we can coordinate our actions. We could instead walk to the opposing ends of the table, but that seems silly. That's just a waste of time and energy. The standard theory's inability to resolve such trivial coordination problems triggered the development of the theory of team reasoning. So how does this theory work? When a best response reasoner approaches the game, she focuses on the question, what should I do to promote my interests? And the answer is, choose a strategy associated with the highest expected personal payoff given your belief about other players' actions. When a team reasoner approaches the game, she focuses on the question, what should we do to best promote our interests? And the answer here is identify a strategy profile, a set of actions for each player in the game that is associated with the best outcome for players as a group, and then play your part in realizing that outcome. In the high-low game, it's obvious that mutual choice of the high prize is the best for both players as a group, And so team reasoning resolves the Nash equilibrium selection problem by prescribing the play of high. But this does not always choose the Nash equilibrium. If mutual cooperation is the best outcome for both players as a group in the prisoner's dilemma game, team reasoning can also explain why some people choose to cooperate in this game rather than defect. And that pretty much summarizes the core principles of the theory. Of course, the theory still needs to clarify many details, and in the rest of this introduction, I will give a brief overview of various directions in which the theory has been taken to fill in those details. The first question which the theory needs to address is, when do we actually team reason in games? According to one interpretation of the theory, this depends on the individual's psychological makeup. It's a matter of one's psychological frame of mind, the we frame or the I frame through which a person approaches a game. So when we approach a game, we either ask the question, what's best for us, or we ask the question, what's best for me, and act accordingly. According to this interpretation, whether we team reason or not may lie outside of our conscious control. Furthermore, someone who engages in team reasoning will automatically act on what team reasoning tells them to do. According to another interpretation of the theory, a player may choose to endorse team reasoning only when she has sufficient assurance that others in the game team reason too. So here, someone who engages in the team reasoning procedure asks the question, what's best for us, but also the question, do others think like me? And whether they will choose to act on what team reasoning prescribes depends on what the answer to the second question is. So based on this view, whether we act on what team reasoning prescribes is a matter of our conscious choice. It is fruitful to separate the team reasoning procedure into two separate steps. First, we identify the answer to the question, what's best for us in the game, and then we decide on whether we want to act on what team reasoning prescribes. Furthermore, this view allows one to engage in multiple modes of reasoning simultaneously. There is nothing prohibitive about asking the questions, what's best for me, what's best for us, and do others think like me, all at the same time, to seek answers to those questions, to be motivated by the answers to those questions, and then decide on what one wants to do. The second question which the theory needs to address is, what do we do when we team reason? In other words, which outcomes of the game do we identify as the best outcomes for the team? One suggestion is that team reasoning players seek out Pareto-efficient outcomes. An outcome of a game is Pareto-efficient if no other outcome is possible that could make some player better off without hurting anybody else. In the high-low game, the mutual choice of high price is the only Pareto-efficient outcome. However, in many games, there are many Pareto-efficient outcomes. And a good example is the prisoner's dilemma. Here, mutual cooperation is a Pareto-efficient outcome, but so is an outcome that one player prefers the most and the other the least in the game. So perhaps, in addition to Pareto efficiency, there are other criteria that team reasoning players care about. One suggestion is that team reasoning players try to maximize their aggregate payoff. In other words, they try to maximize the sum of payoffs across players. Now, this would select mutual cooperation as the uniquely team optimal outcome in the standard version of the prisoner's dilemma game. However, there are two issues with the maximization of aggregate payoffs. The first is that this assumes that payoffs are interpersonally comparable. Now, that is not a problem if payoffs are some material payoffs, such as, for example, money. But if payoffs are merely numerical representations of players' preferences, then that means that preference satisfaction has to be interpersonally comparable in some meaningful way, and that whether that is possible can be questioned. The second issue with maximization of aggregate payoff is that sometimes this can prescribe a complete sacrifice of one's personal interests for the benefit of the group. Now, if the decision to act on what team reasoning prescribes is a matter of one's conscious choice, we might question whether one would ever be willing to play their part in the attainment of a team optimal solution when it ignores one's personal interest in the game entirely. That leads to another suggestion, which is that team reasoning players seek outcomes that are mutually advantageous. One idea for what counts as mutually advantageous is that every player should get more than their maximum payoff in the game. A maximum payoff is a payoff that a player can guarantee for themselves individually, irrespective of what other players in the game might do. In the prisoner's dilemma game, it is the payoff 1 to both players because that's what they can guarantee for themselves by defecting. So that makes mutual cooperation the only mutually advantageous outcome in this game. However, this idea of mutual advantage can identify many outcomes in games as mutually advantageous without further discriminating between them. In the high-low game, mutual choice of high and mutual choice of low both are mutually advantageous outcomes relative to the maximum payoffs of 0. So that led to a further suggestion. The team reasoning players identify mutually advantageous outcomes in games and then seek to maximize the extent or some measure of mutual advantage that is offered by those outcomes. The third question concerns what type of agent we are when we reason as part of a team. When we best response reason, we construe of ourselves as individual agents who react to their own beliefs about what other players in the game might do. When we team reason, we construe of ourselves as agents who are part of a group, part of a collective. What this agency transformation as we shift from one mode of reasoning to another entails is open to different interpretations. In a very strong sense of the term, when we team reason, we become collective agents with characteristics such as collective preferences, collective beliefs, and joint actions that are sometimes no longer reducible to characteristics of individuals. This reading of agency transformation suggests a major shift from the core principles of orthodox game theory, which are enshrined in ontological individualism. But this is not the only possible interpretation of what this agency transformation entails. Another interpretation concerns factors by which we are motivated to act when we think about what to do in a game. When we best response reason, our motivations can be fully captured by our personal preferences over outcomes and our beliefs about what other players in the game might do. When we team reason, in addition to these two factors, we are also motivated by other players' preferences over outcomes. We need to consider other players' preferences over outcomes in order to work out which outcomes of a game are mutually advantageous. This reading of agency transformation is not such a large shift away from the core principles in orthodox game theory. The idea that we are sometimes motivated by other players' preferences over outcomes is actually implicitly assumed in some branches of orthodox game theory. I won't go into the details here, but the payoff dominance principle in the Nash equilibrium refinement program is one such example. The fourth and the last question that I'd like to mention is what kind of theory the theory of team reasoning is. Is it a normative theory that says what rational agents should do in games, or is it a descriptive theory that merely describes what we often do when we interact with others? If it is a normative theory, then it needs to address a number of further questions. Does it expand the set of rationalizable choices beyond those that are rationalizable in terms of best response reasoning, or does it render some cases of best response reasoning irrational? A good example here is again the prisoner's dilemma game. If cooperation in this game is rational, does it mean that defection is not, or vice versa? Furthermore, if cooperation here is rational, does it mean that the theory rationalizes counter-preferential choice? If, on the other hand, this is a merely descriptive theory, then it hasn't really resolved the crux of the puzzle that was brought to game theory with the example of the high-low game. Namely, why does it seem obvious that rational players in this game should both choose the high prize? More can be said about all these questions, and recent works on the theory have started addressing them in more detail, but I will stop my introduction here. I will share references to various works that I mentioned in this introduction, as well as some further articles that might be good to look at in case you would like to dig into this deeper.